Greetings, students. Welcome to the second part of the lecture on theorizing digital society. So, in the first part, we talked about the idea of information societies, idea of digital society, and the context of power relations in information societies. In this lecture, we are going to look at some more of these building blocks of digital society that has contributed towards theorizing such societies. And this building blocks are starting with the idea of digital embodiment. And then we are going to look at digital archives. And then finally, we are going to look at contexts of metadata. So, um, when we talk of theorizing digital embodiment, it comes from our understanding of the very idea of culture or society that cannot now be understood without the recognition of computer software or hardware devices that have become very intertwined with our understanding of the digital culture or digital society. And the idea of digital technologies, as anthropologists Daniel Miner and Heather Horst would say, like other material cultural artifacts, are becoming a constitutive part of what makes us human. Close quote. So, in the context of digital embodiment, the idea of the body, the idea of the self gets highlighted. And in this theorizing, the period spanning between the 1980s to the first few years of the 21st century, this era has been typically labeled as the era of the cyber in social, cultural, and political theory of research. So during this era, you will see the growth and birth of terms like cyberspace, cyberfeminism, cyber cultures, cybercrime, cyber racism, so on and so forth. So, cyberspace, as we understand it to be, it was defined as a virtual, non physical network in which users interacted with each other by employing computer technologies. So there was a communication, there was an interaction on these digital platforms, on these digital spaces or cyberspaces. And the way these interconnections or communications happened was by employing computer technologies. So this idea of cyber comes from or is influenced by, extensively by the work of Donna Haraway, who is a technoscience feminist scholar. And in her leading works, the idea of the cyborg remained important in its conceptualization. So I'll just retake this one. So the idea of the cyborg is heavily influenced by the work of Donna Haraway, who is a technoscience feminist scholar. And in her leading works, the idea of cyborg remains important in conceptualizing the ontology of the human machine encounters. So Haraway actually talks about boundary breakdown between three forms of interactions in the Cyborg Manifesto. So, what are these three boundary breakdowns? The first one is the human and animal boundary transgression. The second one is the organism and machine boundary transgression. And the third one is the physical and non physical boundary transgression. So all of these boundary transgressions is informed by Haraway's work on the cyborg. And Haraway argues that there are two types of cyborg that we see at various ontological levels. So the first type that Haraway says, the first type of cyborg is the material cyborg. And this is the type of cyborg that Haraway finds examples in the military industrial entertainment complex in the 1980s when we see more of these science fiction films the human machine interaction, the medicalization or medicalized bodies, and that is normalized by the advent of technologies. So we see a lot of the expression of the material cyborg that we see around us in society, and this is emerging from the 1980s onwards. The second type of cyborg, identified by Harvey in her work, is the metaphorical, the ontological cyborg. And this cyborg is a figure that challenges the assumptions and binaries, that is politically disruptive, progressive, and oppositional in its hybridity and liminality. So, this is the idea, the ontological cyborg is the idea of the boundary transgression, the challenging of the binaries, and sort of accepting that binaries do not exist, or existence of binaries can be problematic. Rather, what Haraway says is that we are multiple bodies and multiple selves, depending on the context in which we find ourselves and other bodies and non human entities in which we interact. So, with the idea of ontological cyborg, Haraway also brings in the idea of fluidity in the understanding of cyborg, in the understanding of embodiment, in the understanding of how we conceptualize the body with the advent of technologies and the use of technologies that has gone into that. So, what Haraway also brings into question is that the advent of the two types of cyborgs, whether it's a material cyborg or an ontological cyborg, has had profound influence on how we live in society, what we do for a living, the advance of sciences, and across the sciences like biosciences, computer sciences, and its major impacts in contemporary culture. So Haraway, for example, states, and I quote, I argue for a politics rooted in claims about fundamental changes in the nature of class, race, and gender in an emerging system of world order analogous in its novelty and scope to that created by industrial capitalism. We are living through a movement from an organic industrial society to a polymorphous information system, from all work to all play, simultaneously material and ideological, from the comfortable old hierarchical dominations to the scary new networks I have called the informatics of domination. Close quote. So Haraway, in this quote, has exemplified multiple trajectories that we have talked about till now. In addition to talking about the various forms of cyborgs, um, Haraway brings in the questions of social institutions, social stratifications such as class, race, gender, that is informed by this emerging system of world order that is increasingly built on an understanding of cyborgs, and also brings in the idea of informatics of domination, and the presence of informatics of domination in the information society, whereby also alluding to the concept of creation of power geometries in society. So the idea of cyborg has contributed extensively to the understanding of how we understand bodies, um, how technology has influenced embodiment, the question of embodiment, and how we project ourselves in the digital contemporary society or on digital platforms. So, from here, the next building block that I will move on to, and that has contributed extensively to the theorizing of digital societies, is also the question of the creation of an archive. And this is a scale change I'm talking about. So, starting from digital embodiment, which is at a very personal, intimate scale, I am looking at a change of scale here, where we talk about the existence of digital data, and that is informing the growth, the birth of the idea of an archive that is going digital. So And so this is a scale change that I'm going to talk here. So archives, as you may be aware of, are these collection of data repositories, but they're not just repositories. They're not just collection of data. Archives have a function, they have a purpose, and they have this function of not just organizing the past, not just a collection of past histories, but also a very powerful way of imagining the future. So, a good archive would be able to not just capture what it was historically, what happened historically, but would also offer with a projection, with an idea of imagining what it can be in the future. So, and for that knowledge, archives have been extensively used not just for historical knowledge, but also as ethnographic knowledge, also as source of data that has been used extensively for research across humanities, social sciences. And so, what happens when this concept of archive goes digital? Now, there is a politics of archive that is strongly associated with the creation of an archive. And I'm just going to highlight some of these key parts of creation of archive. For example, how we categorize observation on an archive, or how we choose not to include certain parts of information in an archive. So there is a very strong inclusion and exclusion criteria that goes behind the scene in the creation of an archive. And this categorization of observations, discarding of pieces of information that are not related, or the archivist chooses not to include in the archive, narrowing down the conceptual frameworks and identifying what is prioritized, identifies what remains essential, goes a long way to offer what we actually see as an archive. So there is a distinct function that goes on behind the scene, behind creating an archive. And for this reason, archives have, throughout history, been great sources of data. And the silencing of data in an archive, it may or may not be strategic. So sometimes the silencing of the data is strategic, and sometimes it is not. So when we look at an archive, when we look at data that is available on an archive, it is also important for us to reflect on what are the data sets that are not reflected in that archive. And if we have an answer to that, to the second part of the question, then a lot of these strategic functions of the archive becomes clear. So, so coming back to the question of theorizing the archive, we find scholars like Beer and Burrows have identified some components of popular cultural digital data archives. And these components would be including profiles, which are information that are related to the users. And this is information that the user enters about themselves, to take part in online activities, to fill out forms, and provide information about themselves. So that would contribute towards the profile of the user. Um, the second component that Beer and Burrows identifies is the linkage and data intersectionality. Now, intersectionality is a vast paradigm in social sciences that talks about how our social locations are informed simultaneously by our multiple positions of class, ethnicity, age, marital status, so on and so forth. But here, data intersectionality also means how the various points of data are interlinked. And these connections are made either between digital devices, digital sites, digital platforms, and each containing data derived from different methods. So there is an interlinkage of data, and this is called data intersectionality, which also informs the later stages of our understanding of this topic of theorization. The third component that Beer and Burroughs identifies is the concept of metadata. And this is a very, very important, a very core fundamental concept that informs not just the data available on digital platforms, but also data in general. And metadata, to define very, very simply, is data about data. So it is the data that is defining your data. And oftentimes, metadata is practiced through tagging practices, or through labeling practices. When we see something or we have a text, how do we choose to code that data? How do we choose to tag that data? So metadata is a very core principle item behind theorizing in digital societies or information societies. And the final component that Buren Burroughs identifies is that of play, the ludic dimension. And this ludic dimension of using digital media as part of popular culture. And this generates a lot of data that is informed by data linkages, data intersectionalities, that has its own sets of metadata, and so on and so forth. So the ludic dimension is another very important dimension of comprising digital data archives. So following Beer and Burroughs, we see these four components of profiles, of creation of profiles, linkages and data intersectionality, metadata, and the ludic dimensions. So now I'm going to go to the last part of this lecture and talk about the final component of theorizing digital society. And I'm going to draw from Beer and Burroughs's one of the four components that they have identified that goes towards theorizing digital societies. And this component is the component of metadata. Now, as I was saying, that metadata, very simply defined, is data about data. Now, this is a very, very important, a crucial dimension of how digital societies operate, how the information power geometry operates, because this is dependent on who is tagging the data, or who is digitizing the data, or who is sort of inferring that data, who is creating that metadata. Now, for example, if you want to scan a book and preserve a digitized copy of a few pages of that book, what you see is that the scanner would not really identify the text as text characters, but the scanner would save it, the file would be saved in the process of a text box, right? So what you see on the screen is that what the equipment, what the gadget is identifying as metadata is something else that is informing your data. So there are a few dimensions that are associated with the understanding of metadata. And the most crucial of these are the questions of the who, the what, the when, the where, the why, and the how. And this is very classic way of data reporting that is also tied to the understanding of metadata creation. So the who would talk about who created the data and who managed the data. And the where is the study area, geographical, or is it digital? And how can I access the data? The questions of data accessibility comes into question. The what is the data content and the source data was used. The how is, was the data created or is the data distributed? The when is the time period of the content and was the data created? And the why, was the data created and what are the missing values? So the who, the what, the when, the where, the why, and the how are questions that are taken into consideration when a metadata is created. Now, when a metadata is created, um, it contributes to either a data management system or a data distribution system. And the data management system, for example, we have had, examples of the geographic information system, for example, where you have, the maps and thematic layers of maps, showing various components of a spatial geography. And oftentimes the social geography gets superimposed on that. So the geographic information system, as a data management system, brings in a lot of these inferences of how that metadata was created. The metadata also enables us to search. And it's a very simple example that when we search something on a search engine, for example, on Google or any other search engines, we type in certain keywords. And what we see on the screen as data retrieved is because these data are retrievable because they have been tagged by the keywords that we have typed in the search box. And so this goes a long way for us to understand what data that has been retrieved is only possible because of how the metadata for them has been created. So in the creation of metadata, there are these components of people, tools, and policies that coordinate the type of data that can be managed and the type of data that can be retrieved. So metadata is a very important step in the theorization process to contribute to a whole set of data-driven avenues, and one of the most important avenues being data retrieval. So can you retrieve a particular data or a data set in the future for analysis purposes or other purposes, will be determined how the data has been tagged, will be determined how the metadata has been created. And this idea of metadata often functions on the idea of creation of a subject node, creation of an object node, and the connection between the subject node and the object node. And you must have heard about concepts of the search engine optimization, that when we talk about how frequently something would be retrieved when we search for something, or the concept of linked data that we are going to look at in the next set of lectures. So metadata operates on these structures of operation of subject and object node and the relationship between the subject and the object node. Now, there are various types of metadata that you can look at. Metadata can be descriptive, metadata can be administrative, metadata can be structural, and metadata can be markup languages. So there is a metadata element set that is universally accepted and universally governed. It's called the Dublin Core metadata element set. And it is one of the simplest and the most widely used metadata schemes. And it was originally developed to describe web resources. And over time, the Dublin Core has been used to now describe a variety of physical and digital resources. So you can go to this website and take a look at what the Dublin Core principles are towards creation of metadata. And this is a universal set of guidelines that metadata creators follow in creating a metadata set. There are also examples of digital archives that you can take a look at. For example, the 1947 Partition Archive, just to get a sense of when archive goes digital and is a reflection of social order and social institutions. So the 1947 Partition Archive is an archive that looks at ethnographic cases of migrants, of refugees, of asylum seekers, in the context of the 1947 partition. And you can also look at the Indian Memory Project, which is a digital archive of photographs, but it's crowdsourced. So that is one of the first crowdsourced archives. And you can see, how the expression of a digital archive the ethnographies, the stories, the tagging that go behind the scene towards creation of an archive. With that, I'm going to conclude this part of the lecture, and I hope you are able to connect the dots of theorizing in digital society, starting with the concept of power networks in information societies, to the context of digital embodiment or the digital body or the digital self, to the concept of digital archives, and then finally to the concept of metadata creation. Thank you very much.